Hello, good morning. Testing the English channel. 1, 2, 3. Ok, perfecto.
Buenos días. Welcome.
Good morning. Welcome.
This session is going to take place in English and Spanish, and there are headsets just outside the room. We have simultaneous interpretation. Some of the speakers will be speaking in Spanish, others will be speaking in English. So if you need interpretation, please make sure that you pick up headsets at the door. Ok, muy bien. Buenos días a todas.
Good morning to each and every one of you. I am Federico Bonaira. I'm the adjunct director of the Development Center at OECD based in Paris. It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you in this wonderful city of Cartagena de Indias. It is my first time in Cartagena and the first time at Finance in Common. So first and foremost, we'd like to thank the Secretariat of Finance in Common for inviting us to participate and also to introduce ourselves very briefly so that you know what we do before we move on to the core topic of this panel, which is how to access financial markets for SMEs and growth companies. I'm going to do the first part, and Sebastián Nieto Parra, my colleague, who's the head for Latin America and the Caribbean at OECD, will give you more details about the objectives of this program that we're producing together with several partners. And our moderator will invite the different panelists to share their remarks so that we can have a good conversation. As I said, the Development Center of OECD is a bit particular within the OECD framework because we have member countries who are not member countries of the OECD. The majority of countries in OECD of our clients are from Africa, from Latin America, from the Caribbean, and they participate actively in our work which is of a regional nature. We produce together with institutions like LAC, CAF, the European Union, IDB, different reports on the region to look at topics like structural transformation, inclusion, access to finance. And we also work at a country level on different topics, specifically multinational strategies to achieve the SDGs. Why are we here? We are here because we believe that it is very important to continue a conversation regarding SMEs. As you well know, SMEs account for 99% of companies in the region and contribute more than 60% of formal jobs in the region. But when we talk about SMEs, it is a very heterogeneous environment. Within this SMEs, the micro and the small experience different problems that result in very low productivity. For micro businesses in Latin America and the Caribbean, for instance, we know they have a productivity level that's 6% of productivity of large businesses. So if the goal is to create quality jobs with a high level of productivity, we cannot imagine these businesses, which account for 99% of businesses, can create quality jobs. What will be the objective of our discussion today? Before giving the floor to Sebastián to move more into the content, one of the questions we're trying to answer is how can we diversify instruments, tools, finance for mid and large growth companies. It could be paradoxical to focus on this because these companies are large or medium-sized and of strong growth. We should focus solely on the small and the micro, which have a productivity problem. But actually, it's not so much paradoxical because on the one hand, if the mid and the growth companies are medium and growth companies, they have a productivity level that's higher. And thanks to this productivity level, they can create more jobs. But it's important for these companies to access different finance sources. On the other hand, though, there's different evidence that show how these businesses have preferential access to credit, bank credit, something that the small and micro companies or businesses don't have. And so there's a crowding out effect where these companies that a priori could use other finance sources, they use the simpler instruments and those of easier access, which is credit, bank loans or bank credit. So together with our partner, IDB, we decided to invest in a new study to learn more and better. On the one hand, what are the tools to access finance markets for the mid-size and growth companies? And on the other hand, to look at how different institutions, including especially NDBs who are here at FIX, can support these medium-sized companies to strengthen and diversify their finance sources. This is especially important because in the region, unfortunately, businesses have a finance cost that is elevated. At OECD, we cover with a database called Scoreboard. We cover 39 countries, including 4 in Latin America, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and Peru. And unfortunately, this database, businesses of the region are those that face the spread, the most important difference between the credit rates, the highest in the region. For all these reasons, I believe that what we're going to discuss today is an important subject. It is a relevant subject for fixed discussion, and it's a topic where we have ideas, and having this great panel that is going to explain to us how to facilitate diversification of tools and sources of financing for medium and growth companies, thus reducing the crowding out effect that's going to allow the micro and small businesses to access bank loans. I will stop here and I will give the floor to Sebastian to explain in further detail, better than me, the project. Thank you very much, Federico. Good morning. It is a pleasure to present this project to you that we're beginning with IDB on what Federico was telling you, how we can improve finance of small businesses in Latin America and thus analyze what type of instruments are necessary and how development banks can assist in this. As Federico said, we have a very important challenge in Latin America where productivity is very low for these businesses with respect to the larger companies. And this difference is practically twice that of businesses in the European Union. However, what they see is that the spread is not as large when we talk about the medium-sized companies. Productivity is still lower than the large companies, but the spread with respect to the European Union is not as large, the gap. And what makes us question is how we can better finance medium-sized businesses in Latin America and prevent the crowding out effect for micro and small businesses in the region. If we take as a reference businesses in advanced economies in Latin America, we still see that micro and small and mid SMEs in Latin America only have 25% financing, which is lower than what we have worldwide. So there's undoubtedly an issue here between productivity and access to sustainable finance by these businesses in the region, and that the spread, as you see in this graph, is also important globally, the gap that we have in Latin America. A fundamental matter, and going beyond traditional credit, is how can we improve the quality in the capital markets in Latin America, not only size, but also going into quality of these markets, where, for instance, talking about diversification, the number of businesses listed in the exchange is still very reduced in Latin America when compared to other economies, even mid and high income economies. Another indicator that measures quality, that can be the liquidity of the market, it continues to be very low in Latin America when compared to other economies, even when compared with mid high income globally. So with respect to this dynamic, there's no doubt that we need to find how to improve access to medium-sized businesses, how NDBs play an important role, because there is no doubt that we need to see how to channel projects where there's green components, also digital components, and gender, in which NDBs in Latin America have been making progress, and for which in this project and its motivation with IDB is for three reasons. One, the coordination required between the private sector and NDBs, how, thanks to this coordination, one can foster greater amounts in access to credit, and how, as Federico also mentioned, how to make good use of these growth companies in the generation of jobs and strengthen their businesses, and also to increase the number of financial instruments and allow that micro and small businesses can have access to credit that many times medium companies or medium businesses are capturing, and for which we need to look at more sophisticated instruments for these medium-sized businesses. So what we're doing, and we're going to cooperate with NDBs in Latin America, with ALIDE, which is also a very important partner in this project, is to map first the financing of the pattern of these medium companies, their growth, also to identify existing barriers, and lastly, to provide some policy options at Latin American level, but also focused on some countries of the region. There is no doubt the focus also has to do with the types of activities that we see as important in Latin America in the future. And here's everything that has to do with global trends, green transformation, digital transformation, and the skills necessary, especially to not leave anyone behind. Of course, have employees that do not necessarily have the necessary skills, and how NDBs can also accompany or coach on these skills for the most vulnerable. So to begin closing, we have a dual methodology. One is quantitative on the one side, surveys that we are going to share with different actors, with businesses, of course, but also with market actors, private banking, NDBs, and regulators, to better understand the dynamics that we have in the capitals markets, and a quantitative analysis that also allow us to better understand at company level what are the differences between the companies that are listed and those that are not listed in Latin America. So this will also help us understand the behaviors of investment of the companies that already have access to the capitals market, and why others that have similar number of sales or employees have not been able to achieve. So we have three important stages. One is to have a note of the results of these surveys. We are going to have a dialogue with the different players, not only drafting the report and sharing the conclusions, but the idea is also to have workshops to discuss with the different market actors, and those workshops surely allow one to understand the different dynamics and improve the processes, and of course, finally, produce a final report with the recommendations and follow-up. So with this, I conclude my presentation. I will give the floor to Ana Maria Ibanez, Press Sector's CEO at IDB, to moderate this session. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muy bienvenidos todos.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here moderating this panel. which is truly a very important and interesting panel. I'm going to be switching between English and Spanish when introducing our different panelists. And like Sebastián said, in the study or the survey we're going to do with them, the medium businesses and growth companies or high growth potential companies are very important because they can promote innovation and they can also help us transit in this green transition and the digital transformation we need to make in our economies. Nevertheless, what we see is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have very large barriers for the micro, the small, and the mid-sized businesses have access to capital and financing. We calculate that the lack of financing of all these companies, or the finance gap, is close to 35% of the regional GDP. And given that we have such large fiscal restrictions, the private investment is going to be very important for the region, and it's going to be very important to achieve the different SDGs that we have. It's been proven that capitals markets are very flexible, that can truly help in financing and allow the businesses access to financing and capital to do innovative processes. And let me give you some figures to back this. Between 2009 and 2021, non-financial corporations were able to find, and this is confusing because I have the names in English, 2.3 trillion in English through IDOs and 6.3 trillion of SPOs. Also, for bond issuance, these markets have been very important, and globally we reached 27 million. Looking at Latin America and the Caribbean, we've seen an increase in financing through these capital markets, but I would say this is just at a very early stage than the participation we have in total markets. So for Latin America, in the same period, 2009-2021, non-financial companies were able to collect 73 billion through IBOs, 355 million through SPOs, which is just 5% of the global total. So we still have an impact and a growth capacity that's much higher. And in bond issuance, it's 977 billion, which is only 4% of the total global total. So we have significant growth, space for growth. And we have many restrictions then for our companies to access these capital markets, compared as well with emerging countries like China and India, where there's a high percentage of companies that are absorbing capital through IPOs and SBOs. So in the next hour, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about several topics. As I ask the questions, I'll be introducing the panelists so that we don't take too much time in the introductions. And what we're going to discuss and explore in this panel is what is the relation between financing, economic growth, job creation, innovations, and sustainability in the Latin America and Caribbean context. We have representatives here from the private sector, from NDBs and other institutions. So we're going to be discussing this at this panel and presently, and thank you very much for attending. And I want to begin with Juan Carlos Mora. It's a pleasure to have you here, Juan Carlos. He's the CEO of Bancolombia. Bancolombia is the largest private bank in Colombia in terms of assets. And I would like to ask you, which do you believe are the barriers that hinder medium-sized businesses to have access to finance? Thank you, Ana Maria. Good morning to each and every one of you, to the other panelists. Thank you, IDB and OECD, for the invitation. I believe that mid-sized businesses in Latin America have a syndrome, and it is that they're not small and they're not large. Therefore, they're in a position that's very uncomfortable. Let me tell you our experience here in Colombia. When we see high potential mid-sized businesses that are well served from private banking standpoint, which is what's traditional in that type of businesses. Clearly, small businesses in Latin America have restrictions in structured formal financing, their access to it. But the larger size do not. But when it comes to going or moving to the next level, that change, that step, and here's where I see somewhat the syndrome. Our experience has been very traumatic. We have accompanied many businesses in the process of becoming public in the equity market. And the experience is very bad, and I'm going to give you or share with you some of the conclusions we've drawn. First, regulatory compliance is asphyxiating for these businesses. It becomes, for those mid-sized companies or businesses, a heavy burden. And the other side, which would be access to more inexpensive resources with sufficient longer terms, does not exist because of market issues. So all the regulatory burden is there, but there's not sufficient liquidity to compensate that greater. There's in corporate governance, companies in Latin America of that size, medium-sized, are not used to managing the rigor of the corporate government. And this also has to do with compliance. So they fall into a trap that doesn't allow them to have the advantages of capital markets, which is access to financing, in a way that meets their requirements. And it has to do with the other side of the coin, which is there's not sufficient liquidity in the markets that allows one to assume those risks. There's not sufficient plurality of actors. And here's where I believe that local governments, local NDBs, but also the banks need to come in and intervene into these is lacking in the market to start generating how to stop these inconveniences that we have at this in this situation. Because I insist, our experience has been very bad. In fact, some of them, after being listed, have delisted from the public markets. Some have access without listing to financing by bonds and fixed income. That has been more successful. It's better. In the equity market, it's more difficult. But we've also understood that mechanisms are required, especially in corporate governance. For the companies, it's very important to work on this. And mechanisms for increasing or covering risks. We've also done this through doing underwriting for these companies that go in the market to be known. And I think there's private and public instances that could work here, but we truly need this dynamics be generated. Otherwise, the development of the market is so low that they're not going to make a difference for these businesses.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. And I do think you're mentioning something that's very important, not only for Colombia, but all the companies or the countries in Latin America. We have a lot of barriers. In fact, when we see the distribution of the size of the businesses in Latin America, we have many large companies, very small ones, and we have a few medium-sized companies. What's happening, what you're just mentioning, is that. So I'm going to switch to English.
Yes, I'm very pleased to have you here, Natalia. Natalia currently serves as the Managing Director of Capital Markets and Sustainable Finance at BNDES of Brazil. And as a public development bank, it's very important to what we are discussing at the moment. So I want to ask you, Natalia, how can a public development bank like yours can channel SME financing towards development objective? Either the green or the digital or any other that you consider that it's important.
First of all, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the IDB and to OCDE for organizing such an important panel. I think that I would like to start just by kind of questioning a little bit, and I think that the challenge in capital markets is not only a problem for SMEs. In Latin America, I mean, not even the big companies, they have proper access to capital markets. So I think one of the streams that we need to really focus is on how we can actually improve and deepen the penetration of capital markets in our region. One of the key questions for us to deliver on the 2030 agenda is really how we can foster financing and lower the cost of capital. If you take some of the markets in Latin America, and I can think about Brazil, the size of the credit market compared to the capital markets is half the size. If you look into the US, capital markets is 6 times the size of the debt market. So just an opening remark for us to think it's another work stream that we need to develop, but that's very important for us if we want really to foster sustainable development in our region, to think how we can actually improve or increase the size and deepen the access. I think that the way we see is that really, and we can think about capital markets in basically 2 dimensions, right? One is access to credit, and the other one is access to capital. And BNDES has been organizing our actions into the 2 directions, right? And we have initiatives in the 2 directions. What we have been trying to do is really to see how we can deploy our own funds to democratize access to capital markets in these 2 dimensions. So, and let me go one step back and just to talk a little bit on how we act with SMEs and how I think that how we should be moving towards and what are the targets that we have in our acting. So primarily we are a wholesale bank, so we don't provide support to the SMEs at the end of the scale. So primarily we foster credit lending through our financial agents. One of the key actions that we have made in the past is really to use our capital in the sense to guarantee the credit risk of SMEs to the financial agents in order to scale up our action, and this has been very successful. The model that we have designed is really that we only guarantee up to 80% of the credit risk, because then we can make sure that with the commercial banks, they have their skin in the game and they will advance the agenda. What we need to develop is really, we are not tying our credit deployment to specific metrics related to innovation, to climate finance, and etc. And this is something that we are really designing on how we can be more effective to align the deployment of our capital towards the key challenge that we have. So this is one thing. I think, interesting enough, we are doing a much better job in fostering the access to SMEs to the equity capital markets. And in that sense, we have like 3 initiatives that I would like to comment. So one of them is really, we have a program that we call BNDES Garaging, which is really BNDES Garage, which is our program to accelerate startup. And in that particular case, we are in the 3rd edition of the project. It started very small. We were kind of accelerating 45 SMEs per cycle. It's very focused on small size. And we decided to, in that sense, add a lens of impact. So we only are accelerating SMEs that are either solving environmental or social projects and have in their objective to generate sustainable financial results. We have accelerated companies in different areas. One very good example that I wanted to give that relates not only with environmental and social, but also with diversity, is really a company that we accelerate, a startup that we accelerate that has enabled women in Brazil to denounce violence. It's an app that has had a reach all over Brazil. So basically, because we don't have police stations that can manage violence against women in all the municipalities, but just by clicking in an app, you can denounce, and we can get protection measures that are in the Brazilian law to these women. So this was a very good example. We are now scaling up this program. In the next cycle, we will be accelerating 100 startups per year, so 400 startups in the next cycle. But we are also ambitious in the sense that we need to see how we can integrate the acceleration program to our equity investments portfolio, the VCs that we have in-house. So that's the second step. Also, in the beginning of this year, what we have done in a very counter-cyclical measure, we launched a public call to select asset managers to, and BNDES will going to be investing up to 120 million dollars to select 5 funds, 2 funds for seed capital, 3 funds for growth capital, to also invest in startup companies that are related and working in this social, in the impact business as well. So these are 2 examples, and I think that the challenge that we have is how we scale up. The good thing about the VCs and selecting an independent asset manager is that once we put the BNDES label, we are able to crowd in the private sector. So we limit the amount of resource that we commit to 25% of the fund, meaning that at least we will raise, for every $1 that we put, we will raise another $4 of private capital investment. And the third action that I would like to comment is that we also are designing, and we'll have a specific panel in the afternoon today to talk about blended finance initiatives. So this is another thing that we've done. So we were the pioneer bank in Brazil just to commit our own grants to put together a blended finance fund that will actually basically focus on 3 main objectives. So it's social environmental projects, urban development, and and circular economy. The idea of the blended finance is really to use our grants as catalytic capital to de-risk projects and, again, attract investments from the private sector. It was a very successful experience. We committed only $10 million in funding, but we received more than 100 proposals. We selected 11 projects that will together bring in another another 200 million. I'm just trying to convert from reais into dollars. 200 million. So it's 10 million from the BNDES dollars, 200 million from the private sector to invest in using different types of instruments, because blended finance is not about the type of instruments, but also about the governance, how you bring different actors together to foster that initiative. So these are 3 of the examples that we are trying to foster. But again, this is very relevant. SMEs are the majority of the part of the economy in all countries in Latin America. And I think that we need to be very smart in the way that we support them and think creatively on how to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. And I think what you mentioned is very important, because this shows really the power of public national banks to crowd in private investment, but also to reach development goals that are very important for our country. So thank you for those very powerful examples. Now we have Isabel Lebeau. Isabel is the International Partnerships Development Manager of BPI France. And I would like to ask you to share with us BPI's strategy to promote access to finance to SMEs, and what kind of approaches have you used, such as debt instruments or equity, and which have been more effective?
Yes. Hello to all. Sorry not to be able to speak in Spanish for the Spanish language. But I learned Spanish, but I understand more or less all the words, but la conjugación is difficile for me, so I will speak in English. Yeah, with your question, I would like first to highlight the fact that the model of BPI France, because I think everything is linked more or less to this model. It's an integrated model. It's a decision that has been taken that all the different business lines allowing to help companies will come under the same roof. And so we are financing, we are the French Public Investment Bank, we are dedicated to finance SMEs, and we have integrated on a path of, I don't know, 30 years, so it was not just in 1 or 2 years, the financing part, the guarantee part, innovation activities and innovation financing for company, equity financing also, and now business support, and of course also export credit agency. We are the French export credit agency. So we have this whole range of products for SMEs, and I would say that our model is to say that we have built we say always that at BPI France, we have built a continuum of financing for SMEs. So I don't know if this is transposable in other geographies, perhaps not, but at least we have done this original model. We have, and it works because it's quite, you can have quick actions, because as we can have these different possibilities of intervening among SMEs with SMEs, it's very quick. We can have a quick action for that. To go a little bit more in detail, I would say also that what we do, what is written in our doctrine, is that we are never doing things by ourselves. We are always doing with partners. So we are co-financing. We are financing with banks, private banks. So if a private bank is financing, we can go with this private bank and financing the same project. If there is no financing from private banks, we say there is no reason that we intervene. We don't want to break the market. We want to push the market. It's the same for investing. We are not investing by ourselves. We are investing with private co-investor. So we are sure that the project is interesting for the market, for everybody. We are sure that there are also private companies that will invest in that project. And so it's always the same. We give a push to that. To go more at the beginning of the history of BPI France, we can say that this model, the co-financing, was very effective, because we started to be like an animator of the banking system in France. We were not in competition with them, but we tried to bring them also a support, and a support not only in financing, but in giving guarantee for companies in the different risky, in their life cycle, in the different risky part of their life cycle, like creation, like innovation, like internationalization, like transmission. All those activities are are very risky, and banks are very reluctant to give money to SMEs if they are smaller SMEs, and with the guarantee that we can bring, it's easier for the banks to give money to the companies. We get guarantee from 40 to 70% in some case. And this guarantee is delegated, part of this guarantee is delegated directly to banks. So we have not to give an agreement for each guarantee. They have an amount, and up to this amount, they are able to do by themselves. And after this amount, if it's bigger amount, then we look at the file and we ask for more information before giving the guarantee. The other thing, because we are the innovation agency in France, we are providing innovation financing to the companies from the very beginning of their project to their going to the market later on. And so we have also built between innovation and equity, because both are go together very often. We can help SMEs for their innovation projects with subsidies. Subsidies are only given for feasibility project, to know, is this project viable? Yes, no, so we give a small amount. If it's viable, then we go further on and we can give a bigger amount. If the company looks for equity, we can give the company a seed loan. If the company has very good result, for example, we have some kind of challenges that are led by the Ministry of Research, and the companies that are very good at these challenges, we can give them also, in some conditions, innovation loans. And this is also a real push, because for we can give the double that they have raised in equity, we can give them in loans. So it's very selective, this part, but it's very efficient to push the company to grow. And then, because now the market has evolved, and we have also 10 years ago, BPI France, we tried to raise up a lot of startups, and now we have scale-ups. So we are also obliged to change our model, and we are also changing our model every year, or to be compliant, to be with what is asking by the market. And so we have created also a large venture fund for given more equity to companies, because if not, we are financing a lot, we are giving equity, because we are direct and indirect investors in France, to co-investing with structures, or co-investing directly with private venture capitals. And then they ask for a sum of money, but then now they are asking for 15 million or more. And if we don't have the capability to give it to those very brilliant companies that may change the market, that may change what we do tomorrow, the technology of tomorrow, they will go to the US. I don't know how it is in Latin America. Do they go also to the US, or do you have your internal market? But so we try to not to stop that. It's difficult, and sometimes with some kind of technology, the startups have to go to the US. But we try at least to organize an internal market at European level. That is quite new what we do, so with other partners in Europe, and we try to do that. I would just mention the fact that warranty was a very strong tool at the very beginning. With €1 that you give, at least you can have 10 euros given to companies. So it's at the very beginning, it's a very strong tool. But now we have evolved, and for the equity, and also because we have a lot of funds, we are managing a lot of different funds, more than 450 partners, and this multiply what we can do by ourselves. And so the investment equity has evolved a lot, and has risen by over 77% in 6 years, from 25 billion to 45 billion today. So that's for our first.
Thank you very much, Isabella. And I think it's important what you mentioned about supporting the firms throughout the cycle of the project with a continuum of products. That is very important. And you both mentioned how to support firms to scale up. So that's very important. Ahora sigo con Brigitte Benci.
I will continue now with Brigitte Bencic. She is presently the CEO of the board of the public bank in Peru, COFIDE, and she also was Vice Minister of Economics in Peru from 2020, December and August 2021. So Brigitte can help us. She can tell us what are the barriers in Peru for the small and micro companies, because you focus more on these, to access financial markets, financing markets, and how to address these barriers and eliminate or at least reduce them, and how to promote greater collaboration between public and private banks in order to overcome these barriers. Thank you. First, I would like to thank for the invitation. COFIDE is the Peru's development branch. It's more than 52 years old, and we play a promoter role of impact in investment, environmental, economic, and social. We play an articulating role because we all know that we cannot do everything alone. We need to articulate with other agencies in the public sector and with the private sector in order to be able to bridge these gaps. And we have an executing role. We are the executor of the government programs. We're the executive branch of the government programs. And during the pandemic and the sanitary crisis, we played a relevant role in programs given to the micro and small businesses, a guarantees program, which purpose was to not break the payment chain in the economy, how to continue maintaining the productive apparatus in operation. We focus mainly on consolidating the micro and small businesses through financial intermediation as executors of government programs and development of capacities. But again, we could not this alone. We need to articulate private and public sectors. So beginning with the intermediation through instruments as a development bank, second-tier development bank. We have been doing the birth of the cajas municipales, which are microfinancial entities, non-bank. The idea is to provide access at more competitive rates to these small, micro and small businesses through government programs. Let me give you some examples, because there's been several programs with much success, with lessons learned for reactivation. And as an executor branch of the government programs. But during the pandemic, we played a relevant role in the counter cycle. A program was created. I was at the time in policy designing. Now I'm in policy implementation. A program called Reactiva. It's a government guarantees program that injected close to 8 GDP points at competitive rates. Presently, the reference rate at the bank was very low, 1%, 2%. And it was guarantees to the entire business network, not to get the business network to break their payments. It was close to 500,000 beneficiaries. It was like, yes, 500,000. More than 90% were micro and small businesses. And guarantees were given, depending on the amounts, between 90 and 98%. The good thing about the program, it's been 3 years since, that there's a repayment culture now. At the beginning, there was a lot of fear in giving guarantees by the state, because this meant honoring at the end. But they were successful in having a payment culture. This program of 8 points of the GDP today is less than 2 points of GDP. So they've been able to amortize. We've been able to have credit expansion of liquidity, whereas we have a financially stable program. Well, this correlates with the real sector of the economy. So there are studies of the program's impact that we will see shortly. And the idea was to provide the necessary liquidity for operability of the economy. Just as there was this program that was very large, at some point, I've actually looked at all the programs that existed in Latin America, but in this case was not leveraging. This was liquidity to the financial program. And we also had guarantee programs, much smaller, for SMEs that also had good results, and in which there's been very high amortization of the programs. There was sectorial guarantee programs, because at the time it was necessary to impact, for instance, the tourism sector, where a very big crisis was experienced. And also now in a reactivation process, all these lessons learned from the existing programs, the programs that Corhide had in light of the pandemic, in order to develop reactivation programs presently in the present economic context in Peru, where all the lessons learned from these programs have been taken in order to be able to reach more competitive rates for SMEs, MSMEs. Last week we had an auction, a program of 5 billion soles. It is much smaller than Reactiva. However, the rates at which the auctions are taking place are less than 13% when in the system rates for an SME are close to 40%. So actually, it's having an impact, and one was able to not break that change, payments change that there had to be in the economy. We have other programs that are more of financial inclusion and rural productive development, whereas are not a financial inclusion per se formalized. The first step includes, well, we have a program called credits and savings, or credits and savings and loans, where associations of people save themselves. They come together and they make the savings themselves and they make loans. They leverage themselves. What COFIDE does in this case is to monitoring the entire program. This is a program that gives them financial autonomy to the communities themselves, because they develop something that's productive and with greater, let's say, results, because they also receive training in order to improve productivity. This is a program where the leaders, it's women leaders, there's female empowerment, so we have a gender focus here. So it's been developed like in 14 regions of Peru. And the good thing is that we were able to convince the government to escalate the program. We're announcing escalation of this program, which has impact assessments with methodologies like everywhere else in the world, and which has been able to isolate the external shocks of these communities. Like, for example, the pandemic. I visited Cajamarca, and I've been told, had it not been for this program, we would be dead. And they've been able to subsist through the pandemic with these productive development programs. And well, lastly, we also have a fund where we see the capital for these entrepreneurships, which are of more higher risk, but that we believe one should also invest in these ecosystems in the earlier stage. And we are also developing slowly. Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Brigitte. And there's also several messages that are important here. First, the role COFIDE played to ensure that these micro and small businesses subsisted through the pandemic and not break, like you say, the payment chain, which was very important to the economy at one point, which was very difficult to do. And something that is also important is all the effort made. You said many important things, but the other thing I want to highlight is the big efforts you made to assess the impact of the programs, and to now pass from smaller programs to programs where there's escalation, which is a challenge itself and is important. And for us at IDB, it's something that we're very interested in learning and to see how we can support you. We continue with Alexis Cruz Rodriguez, who is presently the Vice Minister of Economic and Social Analysis at the Ministry of the Economics at the Dominican Republic. And I would like to for you to tell the public, Alexis, how to differentiate these mid-businesses in Dominican Republic from the much smaller and micro businesses. What are the outstanding characteristics of these firms, this mid-size, with respect to the others? Good morning. I would like to thank OECD and IDB on behalf of the Ministry of Economics, Planning and Development for having invited us to this important panel. Listen, looking or hearing the previous speakers, we have the same issues in Latin America. Dominican Republic has them with respect to access, the limits, the barriers to financing. So you have the same issue in the mid-sized businesses, and they're big because they're big, but at the same time they're not small. And speaking very rigorously, the mid-sized businesses want to be small businesses, and the small businesses want to be micro businesses, and they're cataloged based on the number of employees they might have. Now, we have important situations in the Dominican Republic, the first one being the gap between supply and demand of funds that can be allocated. So you have here that mid and small businesses have greater difficulties in accessing to funds for financing that those that micro businesses can have. So there are programs. Well, there's a size effect, and there's programs to finance micro businesses, both from the private, called microfunds, from the private sector, as well as from the public sector. But what does this lead you to? To criticism, because you have a differentiation in interest rates for a business size different to another business, and therefore is unhealthy for competition, and one continues affecting the mid-sized businesses. There's an important issue as well, which is financial inclusion and bancarization, of which none is exempt, and overall largely affects medium-sized companies. The country has a large proportion of population which lacks access to formal banking, and therefore sometimes they're prisoners of financing by an informal banking with extremely high interest rates, which sometimes demand guarantees, especially from the mid companies, which are the ones that can have them, that end up leading them to bankruptcy. There's a digital gap that is relevant in our country. One of the lessons learned from COVID-19 is the importance of having access to connectivity. Connectivity in Dominican Republic, we've made big strides. We know we're a country that's more or less like in the middle of connectivity. However, there's regions that have no service, especially by the service companies. There's outsourcing by someone who can provide the service. This morning when I got up, I started reading the newspapers digitally, and a micro business from Dominican Republic which provides web page creations. I saw an ad by them pop up where they said, if your business is not in the internet, it does not exist. And a lot of this happens to medium and small sized companies because they were impacted fundamentally during the COVID-19 pandemic. Resulting from all this, we have an information issue. Clear information that can hinder administration of the businesses and therefore of having organized the businesses. And by lacking a general organization, this also hinders access to financing. This can be solved partly, well, contracting somebody to provide assistance or advising on this could be costly. It could be solved in part by accessing the media, but if there's no connection, well, this turns into a vicious cycle. Something relevant as well that affects all size companies in our country is the informality, the level of informality. With the pandemic, we have had, well, all of this impact, especially in the labor market, that have left formal jobs for informal jobs. But also, if in the past we had problems for formalizing, especially the small and micro businesses, the issue now has grown deeper. So a company that's informal, so it is difficult for them to have access to financial markets. There's a lack of education, financial education, whereas it is true that one can have somebody that presides a micro, small, medium business that can be bankerized. He or she does not have the adequate financial education and therefore could access finances or can have access to financing that's not the adequate for his or her company and ends up in excess financing or debt distress, rather. We have sometimes they need to access consumer loans to finance their businesses. So there will be ups and downs in the market, in the products, and an individual will be the one affected and not the company, and therefore loses the guarantee and also affects his or her business. The other thing is if they have access to interest cards, they can finance their businesses through these cards. And that in our country is the highest interest rate. So there's no rationale behind this attempt to financing. They lack fixed assets they can provide as guarantees to access financing of their businesses. They don't have an asset. And it doesn't matter the size. In the Dominican Republic, therefore, businesses want to be an SME because they can access other funds without guarantees. There's not much demand on them. And of course, in our market, in our stock market, it is relatively new, not very deep. Mainly government bonds are traded here. Just not long ago, a very important company, a large-sized company, issued bonds or in a stock in our market. And recently, another company announced it was going also to list in the market. So if you're not a large company, it's much more difficult because of organization issues, etc. Something I miss when talking about the funds gap is regulation, banking regulation. In our country, banking regulation is based on risk. And when being based on risk and not compliance, although it's good for supervising the banking, this results in that which are the most vulnerable businesses? Well, it's usually the MSMEs. So funds are allocated to large businesses and even funds, consumer funds, and much less funds to finance these MSMEs. And that's why we have this imbalance in the financing channels. And finally, and not less important, is gender gap. Mainly, in general, MSMEs, which are led by women, they face, just as those presided by men, everything I have just mentioned. But you need to add an additional factor, which is that many times these MSMEs led by women are demanded additional guarantees from them, additional documentation, which further hinders their access. And this is the beginning of this event. In a conversation with a colleague from Argentina, we saw the similarity in this process in both countries. It's basically, and I'm generalizing here, women are more adverse to risk than men. So in the Dominican Republic, when a woman wants to be an entrepreneur in an MSME, she previously has resources with which to finance, and therefore she doesn't have a credit record. So this also plays against her when the time comes to request financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis. You mentioned something that wasn't not recently mentioned for Latin America and the Caribbean, would be the informal markets, informality of our companies that really have a high cost on the growth of our countries and the productivity of our countries. And furthermore, the role of the regulations that our governments do in order to favor these companies. So we are creating attention among the incentives given to remain informal and also the interest rates. So this is very important. Okay, we will wrap up with Ismael Villanueva, and then we're going to do short sessions because we don't have enough time. Ismael is the head of International Relations and Issuances from NAFIN in Mexico. And I would like to ask you, Ismael, how can we how can the public sector and private sector can share the risks of financing the SMEs? Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much to the IDB for the invitation, and thank you very much for the OECD. Thank you very much. And thank you for the question, and take the advantage of talking about what we're doing in our country, in Mexico. Today, I'm representing two institutions. One is the National Bank of Bancomex, as you know, is dedicated to support the SMEs in our country that export and import to generate local currencies, and also the financial institutions that are linked to the development bank, more in the support of the SMEs in regional concept and economical concept in Mexico. Specifically, this link among the public and private sector, we identify it from different angles. First of all, currently in our country, we're doing some different reforms to the laws. We come from different regimes, different governments. So the distribution of our Minister of Finance that depend these two development banks is precisely to support the SMEs. The importance of these movements or these reforms is linked, for example, with the value market law. Currently, we're doing a reform for these SMEs can have access to this concept of value market, changing the procedure as is. Normally, what was being used was to ask a huge amount of requirements and specific characteristics to these companies to be listed in our country. Nowadays, these requirements are being modified or being made more simple, so these companies can access that market and in that way can have more resources for their own processes. In the banks, development banks, what we're doing is to increase the amount of participation regarding the guarantees and counter guarantees. This, instead of the government granting subsidies, it's the development bank through their own capital who is generating these types of guarantees and counter guarantees to improve the access to finance on behalf of the SMEs. Evidently, with the idea that the sectors or the priority programs that the federal government wants to promote, and with this concept of guarantees and non-guarantees, basically 80% is guaranteed of that credit granted to an SME. 80%, for example, to vulnerable sectors, vulnerable population, or regions that are vulnerable. For example, in the southern part of the country, which is one of the regions in Mexico that is unprotected. So that's why these programs makes these companies really have the opportunity. Evidently, it's always important to highlight that we, as already mentioned by our colleagues, we have the same problems, meaning nowadays Mexico has 60% of companies in informal companies. So this is very, very impressive compared to those who do not have access to credit, do not have a way to really show, they don't have financial statement to be analyzed, they do not have registration of all the sales they do, so automatically they have all their doors closed from these intermediates. And afterwards, these agencies, non-banking agencies that already mentioned by the Vice Minister in Dominican Republic, we have also high rates. What are we doing? Supporting them. How can we support them? Through specific programs, meaning, first of all, to train the non-banking agency, give them the training, financial training, so in a way they can improve their internal processes, leading to reduce those rates so that they arrive to the SMEs in better conditions. We are using the training for the SMEs, but also the training for those intermediates, non-banking agencies that did an excessive use of the availability of non-access to credits to the SMEs. Other activities that we're developing in both banks is linking with sustainability. We identified that the mission of thematic bonds, we believe that through different public investors, we call them afores. These are institutions that manage the resource of the withdrawal of all the employees. They, through the regulation, invest in different tools. These tools that the development bank is issuing, these are topic bonds that are destined afterwards. So these resources, the bank can loan the SMEs. So fortunately, with accessible financing, using concept of the ASGs, the SMEs can have access to better resources. What we have said in different presentations today and yesterday, while the development banks have the possibility to access better resources with better conditions, can really give those conditions to the SMEs, and they can translate it. That's why in Mexico we can develop them. This strategy has been implemented for more than 3 years, meaning this government is going to be the 5th year in government. After the 2nd year, we started to do these modifications in the way how we could manage and we can finance the SMEs quickly. Another activities that we have in Mexico, already mentioned by our colleague in Peru, is the concept of a company that we call it in capital investment company. This is the shareholder, the main shareholder, and this company is seeking funds to support the SMEs. So this is another way as a development bank will translate these resources to these funds that can help the SMEs. So, and finally, we also should see inside the development bank and the improvements that we have to do in the internal processes. Banco Nacional de Comercio Exterior, they changed the criteria how to rate the SMEs that had financing from abroad for the selection criteria in the financial analysis to have access to these resources. This led that Nacional Financiera reduced 40% of the procedures, and I'm talking about 40% is a huge amount of documents and bureaucracy that we had inside the bank that evidently it was a barrier for the SMEs to access these credits. So reducing the capacity of these formats and to ask for the information, timings, what is happening is that the resource is arriving speedily to the SMEs. And finally, the one that is one of the most important presentation cards in Bancomex is the productive chains. Now today, the productive chains are a process or product of Nacional Financiera that is always in the market. So the rates offered in those who participate in the productive chain, and furthermore, the anchor company that is anchoring the SMEs and are providers of this company. So really, this is very important. These are very low to be able to discount. What is discount is translated in a cash flow immediate at a very low price to those SMEs that have a financial cycle that is very agile. And if they don't have that flow identified as a contract or a bill that is at 60, 120 days, or 180 days in an anchor enterprise, they're going to kill them. So the idea is to be much more efficient in order for the SMEs can go hand in hand with us and discount that cash flow so they can survive or at least float in the market in our country. The final concept I would like to share is the importance which implies having the access to resources. Today, the Fondo Verde para el Clima has supported us to be an entity for direct access. The institutions of the developed banks faced with these institutions that promote, that foster the social governance and environmental aspect should be another alternative. So us as NDPs will have access, agile and direct and low-cost access to our products and to really trespass these products to the SMEs, that with a stimulus in these aspects, environmental and governments. So we did identify that our country is concerned of changing the governance of the companies. This is important. We should be much more aware and make them aware that these SMEs should be really much more formal, and with these incentives that our government is doing, really can approach to the formal concept, that they can be also credit subject and increase the participation number. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you very much, Ismael. Very interesting. You mentioned something very similar as Juan Carlos, the difficulty to access to the capital markets due to all the procedures and bureaucracy, and something that we have to think about is how to be much more efficient inside our own institutions. So I cannot ask each one of a question. I'm going to ask a question for all. I would like to ask a question for you to answer. You only have a minute. One of the objectives of this conference, of this summit, is how can increase the collaboration among the different groups who gathered here today, private, public, and the governments. I would like to hear from you. How can we strengthen the collaboration among the public and private banks, and how the public sector can foster that collaboration? Okay, Juan Carlos, can you answer first? Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Quickly, I do feel that the markets in Latin America are overdiagnosed. We have to really go towards the action. To be very specific, the role of the bank, the private banks, is a role of having that relationship with the SMEs, but the local organizations, development organizations, they have different roles. The guarantees is fundamental. Very structured guarantees together with the private sector is what makes the difference. And this is where we have to focus. There's executive tables in the government in which we see different sectors, and there's articulation among the private and public sector. And also we can see the lack of access to financing for the SMEs. So in the government, there already exists, has been developed for more than 10 years, articulator tables among the private and public entities. In COFIDE, we do a lot of articulation, as I mentioned from the beginning. We cannot execute, implement, nor foster if you don't have the private sector as a stakeholder, another public agency, because you're not alone. You cannot be alone. But very well structured guarantees have shown in Peru can be done to make programs, design programs in the companies' networks, not only SMEs, but also in the larger companies too. Thank you very much, Brigitte. Natalia, you have the floor.
For me, I think that the best way to collaborate is really exchanging ideas and best practices the way we are doing right now. I think that just doing the research that you guys intend to do, and by the way, I would love Abi and Jess to join forces and participate. I think it's very important. It's another one because this would be a tangible deliverable for us to question the existing system. And I think that perhaps the third one would be to look at developed markets, what the guys are doing and how we can translate best practices into our markets. For instance, just on the equity capital markets, there are a few exchanges internationally that are promoting or facilitating the access to SMEs to that market. So it's perhaps something for us to take a look at, and also to think how artificial intelligence, tokenization of assets could have a differentiating factor to enable the listing of those companies. So many questions, but I think that the immediate steps, exchange ideas, do the report, and take it from there. Thanks.
Yeah, I totally agree for a start that a guarantee is something really very, very important. And then perhaps enlarge it, so have this dialogue with the bank, but also have a dialogue with the private sector investors. They have association, dialogue with them, train them, and be on the same line to finance SMEs and other actors, because there are also, like you said, honor loans. So there is also a community of associations. At BPI France, we have gathered 26 different associations that gave honor loans in a different way. And so we are giving, if they give a honor loan, we can accompany the company, and we have created an association to be also on the same line. So this is important.
Gracias.
I think that the government should be an enabler to implement special programs together with the private sector that will strengthen business ecosystems based basically in the SMEs, and also to implement public policies that should be efficient, that enable to increase liquidity of loans to SMEs. Specific example in our country, we have used some loans specifically for the construction business that obviously works with the SMEs, MSMEs. So you focus part of that economic resource towards the SMEs because you have a fund, specific fund that can help to promote their own development. This should be accompanied with the flexibilization of the banking auditor, but for those loans for SMEs. And finally, to use the international cooperation to strengthen the SMEs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, regarding your question, what we have identified is innovation financing in programs, in sustainable financial programs. Bancomex, what it's doing is to try to develop programs like sustainable transportation. This, what it does is that we should put on the spotlight that we have a problem at the level of how we move around in our country, and to invite the investor so that he or she can interact with these types of programs. So they invest the resources in these sustainable programs in transportation, or, for example, the lack of energy, and to generate a benefit towards the community through the SME, because the SME should be there as a developer of that transport or that efficiencies through some diagnostic, and to change the way how to use the energy in the different sectors of their the companies. This will improve their own costs in production, services, and will in turn be a benefit. And on the other hand, would be the strategic partnership with international partners. We have to go hand in hand with the international finance sectors regarding these initiatives. It's very important. The way how to learn, how to improve on a daily basis will lead to the development banks to improve our processes, and we can translate these benefits to the SMEs. Thank you very much. Okay, this is an example of collaboration. Wonderful. Okay, we had a very interesting paneling. It was very interesting for Juan and Sebastian. This study is going to really help to have broader discussions. I would like to give the floor to Federico to wrap up this session, and thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up this session, and there are other panels going on. So, first of all, we are very happy to see that the topic we selected is a very relevant topic in which we have a lot of examples here that we can use. And number two, as Benedis already mentioned, You're all welcome to get together in this analysis program, as also with ALIDE and with other partners, clearly with the IDB, and to say that it's interesting to see the different tools, venture capital. We have 1 year to do that. We have fixed 2024. I think that would be a wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yo soy de Paraguay, soy salgo de ahí y nos gustaría mucho desarrollar el convenio que tenemos firmado entre COFIDE y AFD de Paraguay. Soy miembro del director de AFD, que es la banca de segundo piso también de allá, banca de desarrollo. Tenemos un antiguo convenio firmado y identificamos hace poco que nunca pudimos avanzar y nos gustaría hacerlo. Por eso, yo tengo un buen amigo trabajando con ustedes y que me dijo que estaba llegando Manuel de LAC. Sí, llega hasta tarde, entonces él fue compañero de estudios, pero yo quería ya que usted... Okay. De todas maneras quería que usted me conozca y decirle que yo también me sumé a la banca de segundo piso hace apenas 8 meses. Fui viceministro del IPIME antes, entonces voy a tener mucho que trabajar. Y ojalá podamos hacerlo juntos. Y me regala una foto, por favor.